Picture a cabin tucked into the Appalachian foothills, sometime around 1834, deep in the dead of winter. A man wakes at 3 in the morning with a molar throbbing so bad he can't see straight, and the nearest town with anything close to a dentist sits 4 days out through snow he has no way of crossing. He doesn't panic, though. He reaches for a tin on the shelf, a gray powder he mixed himself out of things that never came from a store, works it along his gums, and he's back asleep within the hour, with most of the pain gone. That tin is where this whole story starts, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because that man wasn't some kind of expert. He was just a man who'd been taught, same as his father before him, that you don't wait on help that isn't coming. Nobody was driving 4 days through a blizzard for a toothache, dentist or not. So frontier households built their own answer out of clay, charcoal, bone, and whatever grew nearby, and that answer worked well enough that entire generations went their whole lives without ever sitting in a dentist's chair. I want to be straight with you about something before we go further. This isn't a story about people who never had tooth problems, because they absolutely did, some of them terrible ones. It's a story about how ordinary households handled something we've completely handed off to professionals and toothpaste companies. Most folks today couldn't tell you what's actually in the tube they squeeze out every morning, let alone make something that does the same job from raw ingredients. That kind of knowledge used to just live in a kitchen cabinet, passed down without anybody writing it in a book. Formal dentistry, as we understand it, barely existed for most of the frontier period. There were no dental schools worth mentioning until well into the 1800s. No licensing, no standard training. What existed was scattered, expensive, and almost always in a city, which meant it might as well not have existed at all for a family 200 miles from the nearest one. So people did what people always did when the system couldn't reach them. They built their own version of care out of necessity, using whatever their land and their memory gave them. Think about the actual geography of it for a minute. A settler family working land in Kentucky, Missouri, or the Ohio Valley in the early 1800s might be a week's travel from a town with a barber surgeon, let alone a dedicated dentist. Even once towns grew and dentistry started to professionalize, it stayed a service for people with money to spare, which most frontier families simply didn't have. So dental care, real dental care, wasn't a once-a-year appointment. It was daily prevention, built into the same routine as hauling water or tending the fire. A mother teaching her children to care for their teeth wasn't handing them a store-bought brush and a tube of paste. She was showing them which twig to snap off a certain tree, how to fray the end into soft fibers with their back teeth, and what to rub along the gums afterward. This wasn't folklore passed around for entertainment. It was maintenance, treated with the same seriousness as sharpening a blade or patching a roof, because a rotten tooth on the frontier could turn into a life-threatening infection with no doctor for 100 miles in any direction. The chew stick is where most of this starts, and it's older than the frontier itself, going back centuries across a lot of different cultures, who all landed on roughly the same idea independently. You cut a green twig from certain fibrous trees, chew one end until it splits into soft bristles, and use that to scrub the teeth and work the gums. It's crude compared to nylon bristles, but it did the actual job, physically knocking loose the film of bacteria and food that builds up on enamel throughout the day, which is most of what a modern toothbrush is doing anyway. Alongside the chew stick, salt and charcoal did a lot of the heavy lifting. Fine salt worked as a mild abrasive and helped control bacteria in the mouth, something people understood from experience even without knowing the microbiology behind it. Charred wood ground down to a fine black powder was rubbed directly onto the teeth, and it's a practice you'll find recorded across a long stretch of history, because charcoal is mildly abrasive and it binds to certain compounds in the mouth, which is part of why you still see charcoal turning up in toothpaste marketing today. Willow bark deserves its own mention here, because it wasn't really about cleaning the teeth at all. It was about surviving the pain when something had already gone wrong. Willow bark contains a compound called salicin, which your body converts into something very close to what's in modern aspirin, and old-timers chewed it or brewed it into a bitter tea for exactly that reason. It wouldn't fix a rotting tooth, but it could get a man through a night of throbbing pain until whatever needed to happen next, whether that was waiting it out or pulling it, could actually happen. Eggshells were quietly one of the most valuable things in a frontier kitchen, and almost nobody threw them away without a second thought. Dried out and ground down into a fine powder, eggshell is mostly calcium carbonate, which is the same basic mineral family your enamel is built from. Families would save shells for weeks, crush them fine enough that there was no grit left to feel, and work that powder into whatever tooth care mixture they were using. It wasn't glamorous, but it put real calcium back in contact with the teeth on a daily basis. Put those pieces together and you start to see the actual formula Frontier households were working from long before anyone called it a formula. An abrasive to physically clean the surface, something to fight bacteria and balance the mouth's chemistry, and a mineral source to keep feeding the tooth what it's made of in the first place. Different households used different combinations depending on what grew nearby or what animal they'd butchered that season. But the underlying logic held steady across an enormous stretch of the country, from New England down through Appalachia and out into the territories. Here's the part that's easy to miss if you're only thinking about it as old folk practice. Some of this genuinely worked, not because of superstition, but because of basic physical chemistry that people figured out through trial and repetition rather than a laboratory. Abrasive cleaning removes the plaque film where bacteria live and produce the acid that eats enamel. Mineral powders like crushed eggshell give the tooth surface something to draw from when it's under acid stress. None of it was labeled science at the time, but it was functioning exactly the way modern remineralizing toothpaste claims to function now. Of course, prevention didn't always win, and this is where the story gets a lot less pleasant. When a tooth did go bad on the frontier, and plenty did, there wasn't a gentle path forward. No numbing gel, no drill, no filling that could actually save the tooth in most cases. Once decay got deep enough to hit the nerve, the options narrowed down to exactly one, and it wasn't a good one. This is the part of frontier life people tend to romanticize a lot less than the cabins and the campfires. And for good reason. In towns big enough to have one, you'd find what people called a tooth drawer, and it usually wasn't a dentist in any sense we'd recognize. It was often the local blacksmith or barber, because those were the men whose hands were steady and whose tools were strong enough for the job. A blacksmith spent his whole day gripping metal with force and precision, which made him, oddly enough, about as qualified as anyone around for pulling a tooth that had gone past saving. There was no dental degree involved, just a strong grip and a willingness to do it. The tool of choice was something called a turnkey, and if you've never seen one, it looked closer to something you'd find in a blacksmith shop than anything resembling modern dental equipment. You'd hook the claw onto the tooth, twist and pull, all while the patient was held down by whoever was strong enough to hold him. Anesthesia, if you could call it that, was usually a heavy dose of whiskey beforehand and nothing else. It worked, in the sense that the tooth came out, but it was brutal, and infection afterward was a very real danger. That reality is exactly why prevention mattered so much more on the frontier than it does for most of us today. It wasn't about vanity or a bright smile. It was about avoiding a night in a chair with a blacksmith's turnkey and a bottle of whiskey as your only comfort. When the alternative to daily care was that kind of extraction, people took their tooth powder and their chew sticks seriously, the same way they took keeping a fire going through a cold night seriously. It was survival math, plain and simple, not a beauty routine. As towns grew into cities through the middle of the 1800s, something started to shift. A handful of men began treating dentistry as an actual profession rather than a side job for whoever had strong hands and a steady grip. Dental colleges started forming, tools got more refined, and for the first time, there were people who spent their whole working life focused on teeth and nothing else. It was a real step forward, but it came with a catch that people didn't fully notice until much later, which is that it lived almost entirely in cities. If you were a farming family out past the reach of a railroad, this new professional dentistry might as well have been happening on the moon. It cost money most households didn't have lying around, and it required travel most households couldn't spare the time for during a working season. So even as dentistry professionalized in the cities, the home remedy tradition kept right on going out in the countryside, largely unchanged, because it was still the only realistic option for a huge portion of the country well into the later part of the 1800s and beyond. The real turning point came with industrialization, and specifically with the rise of the toothpaste tube as a commercial product. Companies started packaging cleaning powders and pastes, advertising them in newspapers and later in magazines, and slowly the idea took hold that oral care was something you bought, rather than something you made. It was convenient, it was consistent, and it didn't require saving eggshells or knowing which tree had the right kind of twig. That convenience is exactly what quietly began replacing an entire body of household knowledge that had survived for generations up to that point. Then came fluoride, and this part of the story is worth telling straight because it's genuinely one of the better public health developments of the last century. Starting in the middle of the 1900s, communities began adding fluoride to public water supplies, and dental researchers found it meaningfully reduced cavities across entire populations. It's a real success story, and I'm not here to tell you otherwise. But it also finished the job that toothpaste companies had started, which was convincing people that tooth care was something handled for them, not something they still needed to understand or do themselves. That's the pattern I keep coming back to on this channel, in one form or another. Convenience isn't the villain here, and I'd never tell you fluoride or modern dentistry are bad things. What I will tell you is that convenience has a cost nobody advertises, which is that the knowledge underneath it quietly disappears. Once you can just buy the answer, nobody needs to remember how their grandmother made her own. And within 2 or 3 generations, something that used to be common household knowledge turns into a forgotten skill that sounds almost exotic when you bring it up. Ask most adults today what's actually in their toothpaste, and you'll get a shrug, maybe a guess at fluoride, and not much else. That's not a knock on anyone. It's just the natural outcome of a system built entirely around convenience. Why would you need to know what's in the tube when the tube is right there, cheap, and reliable? The problem only shows up when the tube isn't available for some reason, whether that's cost, access, or just wanting to depend on fewer things you can't make or fix yourself, which is exactly where this old recipe comes back into the picture. And cost is not a small part of this conversation, even now. A routine dental cleaning in this country can run you well over $100 before anything else is even addressed, and that's assuming there's nothing wrong. The moment a cavity, a crown, or a root canal enters the picture, the numbers climb fast enough to make people put off care they actually need, sometimes for years. That's not a criticism of dentists, who are dealing with real overhead and real training costs. It's just the reality a lot of households are quietly living with every time a tooth starts to ache. Here's where the story loops back around, in a way I find genuinely interesting. In the last couple of decades, dental researchers have circled back toward the exact idea frontier households were working with, just with better instruments and a name for it. It's called remineralization, and the basic premise is that early-stage enamel damage isn't necessarily permanent. Under the right conditions, with the right minerals present, a tooth surface can actually rebuild some of what it lost before a full cavity ever forms. That's a real studied area of dental science, not a fringe idea. The mechanism behind it comes down to something dentists call the critical pH, which sits right around 5.5. Above that number, your saliva stays mineral-friendly and your enamel is stable. Drop below it, usually from sugar, acidic food, or bacteria, feeding on leftover residue in your mouth, and the enamel starts losing minerals faster than it can replace them. Keep that acidic environment going long enough, day after day, and you get a cavity. Keep the mouth closer to neutral and keep minerals available, and the enamel has a real chance to hold its ground or even repair itself. Remineralization works because enamel isn't some dead, static material sitting on your tooth. It's constantly losing and gaining minerals in tiny amounts depending on what environment it's sitting in throughout the day. Give it calcium, phosphate, and a mouth environment that isn't constantly acidic, and it will pull some of those minerals back into the surface layer where it lost them. It's not going to regrow a filling-sized hole, and nobody serious in dental science claims that. But for the early soft spot stage of decay, before an actual cavity has formed, this process is real and it's measurable. What gets me about all this is that frontier households never had a name for any of it. They didn't know the words critical pH or remineralization. What they knew, through pure repetition and necessity, was that keeping the mouth clean and keeping calcium in regular contact with the teeth seemed to keep people out of the blacksmith's chair longer. They landed on a working version of the same chemistry modern dentistry eventually put a name to, purely because they had no other option and paid close attention to what actually kept their families out of pain. So let's get into what's actually in the jar, because I've been talking around it long enough, and this is the part you can genuinely go make for yourself this afternoon. It's not some secret formula lost to time. It's a small handful of ingredients, most of which you can find in a kitchen or a garden center for a few dollars total, combined in a way that mirrors exactly what I've been describing. I'll walk you through each one, what it's actually doing, and how to put the whole thing together without overcomplicating it. The first ingredient is a fine mineral clay, usually bentonite, which you can find cheap at most health food stores or online for just a few dollars a bag. Bentonite clay carries a small negative charge that helps it bind to certain bacteria and toxins in the mouth, and it also happens to carry trace minerals of its own. It gives the whole mixture some body and a slightly gritty texture that helps with the physical cleaning side of things, similar to what fine ash or charcoal was doing in the old Frontier mixtures, just a little more refined and easier to source consistently. Second is activated charcoal, ground fine, which you can buy in small jars for a couple dollars or make yourself from hardwood if you want to go the full old-fashioned route. Charcoal is mildly abrasive, and it has a strong ability to bind to certain compounds in the mouth, pulling some surface staining and bacterial residue along with it when you rinse. It's exactly the same principle Frontier households were using with plain charred wood, just cleaner and more consistent because you're not dealing with whatever happened to be left in last night's fire pit. Third is baking soda, plain sodium bicarbonate, and this one is doing the pH work I mentioned earlier. Baking soda is mildly alkaline, which means it helps neutralize the acid that builds up in your mouth after eating, pushing the environment back toward that critical 5.5 line and past it, into territory where your enamel isn't under constant acid attack. It's cheap, it's been sitting in kitchens for over a century already, and it's one of the few pieces of this whole recipe that never actually disappeared from common household use the way the rest of it did. Fourth is your calcium source, and here you've got options. Finely ground eggshell, dried thoroughly and pulverized until there's no grit left, works exactly the way it did 200 years ago. If you'd rather skip the eggshell prep, food-grade calcium carbonate powder does the same job and costs almost nothing in bulk. Either way, this ingredient is the direct mineral supply I talked about earlier, the raw material your enamel actually pulls from during that remineralization process. Without it, you're just cleaning the surface. With it, you're giving the tooth something to rebuild from. Last is optional, but I'd recommend it, and that's a small amount of clove oil or peppermint oil, just a couple of drops. Clove has a long history in dental care, specifically because it contains a compound called eugenol, which has a mild numbing effect and some natural antibacterial properties, which is part of why you'll still find it in certain dental products today. Dwayne here, Dry Creek Wrangler School. Let me ask you a question. Morning. Dwayne here, Dry Creek Wrangler School. Let me ask you a question. Morning. Dwayne here, Dry Creek Wrangler School. Let me ask you a question. The clay and charcoal handle physical cleaning and binding. The baking soda handles the chemistry, keeping your mouth out of that acidic danger zone. The calcium source feeds the actual rebuilding process once the environment is right for it. And the clove or peppermint keeps bacteria in check while making the whole thing tolerable enough to actually stick with for 30 straight days. Leave any one piece out and you've still got something useful, but you lose part of what makes the full combination work as well as it does. As for sourcing, none of this requires anything exotic. Bentonite clay and food-grade calcium carbonate run a few dollars each at most health stores. Activated charcoal is even cheaper, and baking soda is probably already in your cabinet. All told, you're looking at somewhere around $4 total for a batch that'll last you well past that first 30-day stretch, which is exactly the math that gives this whole thing its name. Compare that to a single tube of specialty remineralizing toothpaste at the store, and you start to see why this is worth learning to make yourself. If you want to go the more traditional route and use actual eggshells instead of store-bought calcium powder, here's how that part works. Rinse the shells clean of any egg residue, then bake them in a low oven for about 10 minutes, just enough to fully dry them out and kill off any bacteria. Once they've cooled, grind them down in a mortar and pestle, or a clean coffee grinder you don't mind dedicating to the task, until the powder is genuinely fine, with no sharp fragments left. That last part matters, because grit against your gums is not pleasant. Once you've got your calcium source ready, whichever version you chose, the mixing itself is simple. A rough starting ratio is 2 parts bentonite clay to 1 part activated charcoal, 1 part baking soda, and 1 part your calcium powder, then just a couple of drops of clove or peppermint oil worked in at the end. Mix it dry first so everything's evenly distributed, then add the oil last so it doesn't clump. You're not baking a cake here, so exact precision isn't the point. Consistency and even distribution across the mixture is what actually matters for it to work reliably. For storage, keep the finished powder in a small dry tin or a glass jar with a tight lid, away from moisture, the same way old-timers kept theirs on a shelf away from any dampness in the cabin. Moisture is really the only enemy here, since it can clump the mixture, or worse, let bacteria take hold in something you're about to put directly in your mouth. Kept dry, a batch like this can sit for months without losing its effectiveness, which is part of why this used to make so much practical sense for households that couldn't just run to a store whenever they ran low. Using it is straightforward, and honestly not that different from brushing with anything else. Wet your toothbrush, dip it directly into the powder, or tap a small amount into your palm, and load the brush from there, then brush the same way you normally would, paying attention to the gum line where plaque tends to build up the most. It's grittier than commercial toothpaste, so don't be surprised by the texture the first time. Some people prefer using a fingertip for the first pass along the gums, specifically, then following up with the brush for the rest of the mouth. For frequency, twice a day is the standard, morning and night, same as any normal brushing routine, and that consistency matters more than almost anything else in this whole process. Remineralization isn't something that happens from one good brushing session. It's a cumulative effect built from keeping your mouth's environment favorable day after day, which means the biggest variable in whether this works for you isn't the recipe itself, it's whether you actually stick with it without skipping days. Set it next to your regular toothbrush so there's no excuse to reach for the old tube out of habit instead. In the first week, most people don't notice much of anything dramatic, and that's completely normal, so don't get discouraged early. What you might notice is a slight change in texture on your teeth, sometimes described as feeling a little smoother, since the mild abrasive action is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, clearing away some of the built-up plaque film that a lot of us have carried around for years without realizing it. Some people notice slightly less sensitivity to cold within this first stretch, though that varies a lot depending on where your teeth were starting from. By the second and third week, if you've kept up the twice-daily habit without gaps, this is usually where people start noticing something more concrete. Gums that were a little inflamed often calm down, since you're keeping bacterial buildup lower and the mouth's overall chemistry more balanced day to day. Any early, soft, demineralized spots, the kind that haven't turned into an actual cavity yet, are exactly the areas where this extra mineral exposure has the most chance to matter, since that's the stage where remineralization is still genuinely possible before the damage becomes structural and permanent. By day 30, assuming consistent use, most people report noticeably smoother enamel, less sensitivity, and a mouth that just feels different day to day, cleaner in a way that's hard to describe until you've felt it yourself. I want to be honest with you though. This isn't going to reverse an existing cavity or fix a tooth that's already structurally compromised. What it can genuinely support is the early stage, the soft spot before it becomes a hole, which is exactly the stage where a lot of dental problems start, and exactly the stage where daily prevention has always mattered the most. I need to be clear about something important here, because I'd rather you hear it straight from me than find out the hard way. This powder is not a replacement for actual dental care if you've already got a cavity, an infection, a cracked tooth, or ongoing pain that hasn't gone away. Those situations need a real dentist. Full stop. The same way Frontier households absolutely still needed that blacksmith's turnkey when prevention had already failed. This recipe lives in the same space the old chew stick and eggshell powder did, as daily maintenance and prevention, not emergency treatment for a problem that's already taken hold. If you've got particularly sensitive teeth, gum recession, or any existing dental work like crowns or veneers, it's worth easing into this slowly and paying attention to how your mouth responds, since the abrasive quality that helps most people could be a little much for teeth that are already more exposed than usual. Start with once a day instead of twice, see how it feels over the first week, and adjust from there. This is the same common sense that applied to any home remedy on the frontier. Pay attention to your own body, instead of following a recipe blindly regardless of how you're actually reacting to it. What I keep coming back to with all of this isn't really about the powder itself, and I hope that's come through by now. It's about the fact that you can make something for your own body, out of ingredients you understand, without handing that entire piece of your life over to a company whose formula you'll never see. That's the same principle behind building your own shelter or starting your own fire without a lighter. It's not that store-bought toothpaste is bad. It's that knowing how to make your own means you're never fully dependent on it being available. Let's talk numbers for a second, because I think it makes the whole point land harder than just talking about principles in the abstract. A single tube of standard toothpaste at the store runs you somewhere around $5 to $8, and that's before you get into the specialty remineralizing pastes, which can run considerably more per tube and don't last especially long with regular use. Meanwhile, a full batch of this powder, made from ingredients that'll last you well past a month of daily use, costs about $4 total, and that's before factoring in what you might already have sitting in your kitchen. Now stack that against actual dental treatment costs, because this is where the real weight of the comparison sits. A standard filling can run you somewhere between $100 and $300 depending on where you live and what insurance you've got, if you've got any at all. A root canal climbs a lot higher than that, often running well over $1,000 once you factor in the crown that usually follows it. None of that is a criticism of dentists doing serious, skilled work. It's just the honest math behind why prevention has always mattered more than people give it credit for. A crown on its own, separate from the root canal, can easily run another $1,000 or more depending on the material and the dentist's location, and that's assuming everything goes smoothly with no complications. Put a root canal and a crown together, and you're looking at a bill that can run past $2,000 for a single tooth, which is a genuinely rough number for a lot of households to absorb without warning, especially if it hits at a bad time financially, which dental problems have an uncanny habit of doing. None of this is me telling you dentists are overcharging, or that the system is broken on purpose. Dental care is genuinely skilled, genuinely expensive to provide, and genuinely necessary once a problem has taken hold. What I am telling you is that a lot of households in this country quietly put off dental visits because of exactly these numbers, sometimes for years, and every single one of those delayed visits started as a small, early-stage problem that daily prevention might have caught before it became an emergency, requiring exactly the kind of bill I just walked you through. This is really the whole frontier mindset in one small example, if you think about it. It was never really about rejecting modern conveniences on principle, and I want to be honest about that, instead of pretending it's some kind of ideological stand. It was about not being stuck helpless the moment convenience wasn't available, whether that was 4 days through snow with no dentist in reach, or a bill today that catches a household off guard at exactly the wrong month. The Frontier family wasn't anti-dentist. They were just prepared for the very real possibility of not having one nearby. That's really the through line of everything I try to put on this channel, whether we're talking about starting a fire with nothing, building a shelter from what's standing around you, or in this case, taking care of your own teeth without depending entirely on a tube from the store. A skill you actually hold in your own hands can't be taken away from you the way a possession can. Nobody can raise the price on knowledge you already carry, and nobody can put it on back order when a supply chain hiccups or a bill lands wrong that month. What the old-timers really understood, without ever putting it in these words, is that prevention is cheaper than repair in almost every part of life, not just dental care. A tooth kept clean daily costs you a few minutes and a few cents. A tooth ignored for years costs you hundreds or thousands, and sometimes costs you the tooth itself. That math held true in a cabin in 1834, and it holds true just as much sitting in a waiting room today, even if the specific numbers and the specific tools involved have obviously changed a great deal in the time between. I'd genuinely like to know how your own family handled this kind of thing, because I know a lot of you grew up with grandparents or great-grandparents who had their own version of a home remedy for something like this, whether it was teeth, or a burn, or a stomach ache, or something else entirely that never came from a pharmacy. If your family had a tradition like that, something passed down instead of bought, drop it in the comments below. I read every one of them, and honestly, some of the best material for future videos on this channel has come straight out of that comment section. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that this whole recipe, the clay, the charcoal, the baking soda, the eggshell, none of it required a laboratory or a chemistry degree to figure out. It required attention, repetition, and a willingness to pay close attention to what actually worked and what didn't, generation after generation, without any of it ever being written down in a formal way most of the time. That's a very different kind of knowledge than what gets handed to us today, already finished, in a tube, with a brand name on it, and an ingredient list nobody reads closely. I keep saying this on the channel because I think it's the whole point of everything we cover here, whether it's fire, shelter, food, or something as small as a jar of tooth powder. Convenience isn't free, even when it looks free at the checkout counter. It costs you the knowledge underneath it, quietly, generation by generation, until something that used to be completely ordinary starts sounding like a forgotten secret when someone finally brings it back up. That's exactly what happened here, and it's exactly why I think it's worth bringing back into an ordinary kitchen cabinet again. Next time, I want to walk you through something connected to this same idea, the way frontier households handled infection and wound care before antiseptic ever came in a bottle, because a lot of the same logic applies there too. Plants and minerals doing real work long before anyone gave it a scientific name. It's one of those topics that sounds almost unbelievable until you actually see the ingredients laid out side by side and realize how much of it holds up under real scrutiny, not just nostalgia for how things used to be done. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, old household knowledge that actually still works, laid out plainly without a bunch of hype around it, there's a lot more of it sitting in the rest of this channel, and more of it coming every week. I'm not trying to sell you a lifestyle here. I'm just passing along what's worked, what I've tested myself, and what used to be common enough that nobody thought twice about knowing it. Go ahead and put together a small batch this week if you're curious. 4 ingredients, a jar, and 30 days is a small enough commitment to actually test it honestly for yourself, rather than just taking my word for it. Pay attention to how your mouth feels along the way. And remember what I said about anything that's already gone wrong needing a real dentist regardless. This is maintenance, not a miracle, and it works best exactly the way the old chew stick did, as a steady habit rather than an occasional fix. That's what this channel is really about at the end of the day, taking back the small pieces of daily life that convenience quietly took off our hands, one jar, one skill, one habit at a time. If you want to keep learning this stuff alongside me, stick around and subscribe, because there's a lot more of the old ways still worth pulling back out of the past. I'll see you in the next one, out here doing it the way it used to get done.